Well, thank you very much for coming out this evening, ladies and gentlemen. I propose to talk for a little while about a few subject areas. Hopefully that might spark some other questions in your minds as well. And then I'll take as many questions until we're finished. So let me kick off with the economy, which is obviously the highest point on everybody's minds at the moment. And it has to be said, in a terrible mess. And one of the reasons it's in that terrible mess is because we've borrowed far too much money. The phrase has been used plenty of times that we did not fix the roof whilst the sun was shining. And indeed, that is very true when you consider that a country like Sweden put 2% of its GDP in reserve during those good years, and it's using that money to pump back into their economy now. And Australia actually cleared their national debt during the good years, so they're able to take the tax cuts and borrow money without really affecting their economy. And what is this borrowing? It's £175 billion, according to Alistair Darling, this year. However, most economic analysis feel that it could be £190 billion. That's a difference of £15 billion, which used to be the national borrowing. Now it just seems to be a rounding error. This is the scale of the deficit we're getting ourselves into. And the argument that we were best placed to handle this recession is an absolute nonsense. Because today, Germany and France have come out of recession. Whereas yesterday, the Governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, said that it could be at least a few more quarters before we come out of recession ourselves. So why are we in this position? We're in this position, as I said, due to the reckless borrowing and not allowing us to be able to put money into the economy in the way that the other countries have. And that's caused confidence to wane. That's why we saw the devaluation of the pound. It grew slightly when some of the figures looked more encouraging. Now it's dropping back again. And a lot of people have said, well, it's a world recession. That's got nothing to do with the government. Well, yes, it is a world recession, but my argument is, and the argument of the Conservative Party, is that we are the worst placed nation in the developed world to handle that recession. It's as much about personal debt as it is national debt. Something I need to clear up at this stage. You may have heard the argument that the government have said that our national debt is one of the lowest in the world. And the Conservative Party say, no, our debt is one of the highest in the world. Highest in Europe, third highest in the world. That distinction is thus. The national debt was paid down slightly, but more importantly, the building projects were taken off the government books and put into the PFI contracts. And a PFI contract to build a hospital which may cost £250 million is actually costing the taxpayer £1.3 billion because it's paid back over 25 years with taxpayers' money, and that is part of our national debt and should be included on there. But the personal debt, which was racked up in this country in the last 10, 12 years, is enormous. It's over £1 trillion, and the cuts in interest rates, which were designed to stimulate the economy, have had only one effect: to put more money in people's pockets and clear those credit card bills. Because the borrowing, which we personally took out and took out across the country, ran away in the same way that the government allowed the banks to run away with their borrowing and carry on. And that's a very important distinction. And one of the most important points is that back in 1998, the then Governor of the Bank of England, Eddie George, had a stand-up row with Gordon Brown and Tony Blair and said that if you deregulate the banks and take it away from the Bank of England in the way you're doing, he said we would end up where we are now. And indeed, it has happened. The Conservative Party are very clear on the policy. This week, we are going to abolish the FSA as it stands and put that regulatory control back in the hands of the Bank of England and allow the Bank of England to control what the banks are doing rather than a body which really became a tripartite body overseeing borrowing, which included the Treasury, the Bank of England and the FSA, and nobody would come to those agreements. The FSA is going to be turned into something called the, let me get it absolutely right, Consumer Protection Body, which will be a body set up to ensure that as consumers we have those protections in place that will not allow us to be taken for a ride by banks, etc. But the most important point is that we're going to put full regulatory control back in the hands of the Bank of England. Now, nobody can be under any doubt that we're going to be facing tough times. It's been bandied around, the Mr 10% cuts of David Cameron and his government, slightly unfairly, but the reason that figure came out is because the government have basically in their figures are looking at a 7% cut across the board. However, as the Conservative Party we've said, we're going to have to ring-fence the NHS. Now, one of the reasons we're ring-fencing the NHS is not due to some philosophical, you cannot touch the NHS, but it's the very real problems which face this country in the not too distant future. We've got an ageing population, but more importantly, the rise in binge drinking that we've seen in the last 10 years and the 24-hour licensing, all of the statistics are pointing to that we are going to have a major alcohol-related health problem in this country within the next 10 to 15 years. And that will be a huge drain on the NHS, and therefore it is not the time to cut the funding in the NHS. However, we are going to make sure that funding reaches the front line of the NHS and not get swallowed up in the bureaucracy which lies behind it. And I'll give you a small example, but it's endemic of what happens. The government spent millions of pounds buying vouchers for slimming clinics, and they only gave out 68% of those vouchers, but they'd already paid for them. So the remaining 32% of that money went straight in the bin. Okay? It's not a huge, well, it is a huge amount of money as far as we're sat here, but in terms of the NHS it isn't. But it's an example of the waste which has gone on constantly. And when we talk about having to cut waste, that's the sort of waste we're talking about. Money which has quite simply just been put in the bin. So we'll be if you protect the NHS, that gives you a 10% cut across the other departments. However, we'll come on to defence spending later on, because I want to tighten some other comments. But one of the other areas which we've received some criticism for, but I just want to explain why we're doing it, is that we've also said we're protecting the international development budget. That's 0.7% of GDP. But one of the reasons that we're protecting that budget is actually by investing that money into some of the developing countries, we actually save money for ourselves. Because if we can create better countries and better facilities out there, we reduce the pressure on our own borders through immigration and people trying to flee these countries, etc. And that's one of the reasons that when you're talking about 0.7% of GDP, it's really not worth cutting that money just to try and say, well, why should we give our money away? Because it will help us in the long run. However, again, we are going to look at where that money is spent. So we still give a lot of money to China. I think, and I stand to be correct on this, but I think last year we gave £538 million to China. Well, China is now a well-developed economy, and that's a historical figure which is still going across. We're proposing to actually stop putting money into those developed economies like China and make sure it's focused in some of the more relevant areas so that our money isn't being wasted in countries where, quite frankly, we've been borrowing money off China, so it seems a bit of a roundabout circle to keep giving them money and then borrowing it back. So we know it's going to be tough, but the level of debt in this country is horrific. We are way past the levels of debt that Dennis Healey went to the IMF and got turned down for in 1978. It's small compared to that. And the trouble is, the government action which has been taken so far has always been behind the curve. Now, the 18 to 24-year-old announcement that anybody who's 18 to 24 will be in employment, will be in a training scheme, I ask you, where? Where are they going to be putting those jobs? Because the jobs aren't there at the moment. And they've let down this generation. The generation of the 18 to 24-year-olds now is the highest level of unemployment that we've ever seen in this country. Now, we propose to do a couple of simple things straight off. And really, that is to reduce the burden on business. To reduce the burden in terms of bureaucracy which business has been faced under this government, and to reverse things like the small business tax, which is going to be going up by a couple of pence, bringing that back to 20 pence, reducing the taxation on corporations overall, because tax cuts at the business level will allow business to thrive, will employ more people, will give income tax back, will give VAT back, and those things. We've got to let business grow. Business is the lifeblood of this country. In the last 10 years, every 3 jobs, 2 have been in the public sector, and the private sector's been strangled along the way. But it's the private sector which funds those jobs, and it cannot carry on strangling or cutting the head off the golden goose, if you like, for those business. So we are very much focused on making sure that business can really get back on its feet and thrive in this current situation.